All right, welcome back. And to this, our final section on strategies and techniques for improving our photography. In this section, we're going to jump into the proverbial deep end of the pool by exploring some of the challenges associated with sports photography, low light photography, and underwater photography. But before I tell you all about the wonderful thing that is fully manual mode, let me also remind you that this is supposed to be a beginner slash entry level course. And as such, sure, we're going to explore fully manual mode, but we're also going to look at options for working around it. That is, getting these same shots without having to go and step into that scary world that is fully manual, because I fully appreciate that for some, it's not a comfortable place. As such, we're going to not only look at fully manual, but we're also going to explore alternatives for getting those same shots, preserving those memories, but not having to go through the fully manual mode options. So let's take a look. All right, given that little caveat, let's take a look at some of the challenges associated with shooting sports. First and foremost, your subject is often a long distance from you, sometimes across the field, can be 30, 50, 60 meters away. Second, your goal is to capture that athlete, not the entire environment. As such, you'd like a relatively shallow depth of field, but achieving that from 30, 40, 50 yards away is extremely difficult. Next, the lighting is often very poor. These things, their sporting events are held inside under artificial light, or sometimes even worse, outside in the evenings under pole lighting. Very difficult situations. Let's take a look at how we might get around these challenges by examining how the professional sports photographers do it. First off, they go out there and they buy themselves a 400 to 600 millimeter zoom lens. Unfortunately, the professional sports photographer solution really is not going to work for most of us, because what's the bad news? One of these lenses costs $10,000. Well, we can't do that. Okay, so what do we do instead? Well, there's a couple of things we could think about. First off, consider a 2x converter for your regular zoom lens if you've got one. This is going to push out your current zoom lens to that 400 to 600 millimeter length, but at a fraction of the cost. You're going to talk about a couple of $100 instead of potentially 10,000. Second, consider burst mode if you've got that option on your camera. Burst mode allows you to take a certain number of pictures consecutively within a very short amount of time, thus highly increasing the probability that you're going to catch that event. And that special event, you're going to, instead of missing it, you're going to get it on film. Third, probably most important thing I'm going to say about sports photography, know your sport. Know where to position yourself and when to anticipate the action. My wife's been shooting football games for 20 years because my son's played for many years. You need to know where to put yourself and when to pull that shutter. If you wait to see the action to pull the trigger, it's too late. Or don't have that knowledge yourself. Bring someone with you who does have that knowledge, who can get you set up and go, start pulling now, because you don't get this kind of tackle shot of my son by taking the shot when the event occurred. You need to anticipate that this event is going to occur and start shooting, preferably in burst mode. Finally, accept a little noise in your sports shots. Particularly if these are night events outside under pole lighting, you're going to need to jack the ISO up to, 800. At which point, when you're talking short shutter speeds, noise is just part of the game. I'm sorry. We're going to be able to clean some of it up post hoc in Photoshop, but we're not going to get all of it. And quite frankly, that's just part of shooting sports if you don't have the $10,000 lens, and we don't. My final recommendation for shooting sports, and this one is going to drive all the professional sports photographers crazy, but I really don't care because I'm more worried about getting the shot than I am about the sanctity of sports photography. And that is, consider shooting in movie mode. That is, if your camera also takes videos, take a large number of 20, 30-second clips of the action, and then in post-processing in Premiere, which we're going to learn about in a little while, go in there and grab out your stills. I know it's sacrilege if you're a professional sports photographer, but again, we're not, so we don't care. We just care about getting those images. Good enough. Let's go with that. And finally, before we leave sports photography completely, there is one more alternative to fully manual mode. A lot of cameras are going to have a pre-programmed sports mode. On ours, it's the little runner icon. If I were shooting a football game that was very important to me to make certain I got correct images, that's where I'd be living, because to me, it's much more important to capture the memory than it is to be in fully manual mode. So if you've got a pre-programmed sports mode, that's a reasonable alternative to your fully manual, particularly when you use it in combination with our other suggestions like waiting for the action to slow down, anticipating the action, those sorts of things. All right, now that we've offended all the professional sports photographers, let's see if we can't do the same thing for the low light photographers and see if we can't get those guys angry at us as well. Obviously, the challenge with low light photography is low light. That is, getting enough light onto the sensors without blur, without noise, to actually get a decent image. So, what is the classic solution that the pros are going to use? First, they're going to put their camera in fully manual. They're going to use a tripod, monopod, something like that, such that they can use long shutter speeds. But first, they're going to pick an ISO setting. ISO is normally the first setting you choose when you're in fully manual mode because it's the most obvious. In this particular case, we're going to go as high as possible. 800, 1600, somewhere in that range. We now are going to open our aperture to the absolute max, lowest f-stop possible, and then we're going to choose the appropriate shutter speed. And you go, how do I choose the appropriate shutter speed at this point? Well, you do it based on your exposure meter. This little image here shows an exposure meter, and you just keep changing shutter duration until the little meter reads 0, which your camera is basically telling you, okay, things are properly exposed. Go for it. All right, that's the perfect solution. What if fully manual just scares the heck out of us and we really don't want to go there? A couple of suggestions. First, if your camera has a pre-programmed low light portrait mode, pick it and go with that guy. Long distance low light photography isn't even an option, but up close, that is within 10, 20 feet, you can get things done with that pre-programmed portrait low light mode. On our Nikon, it's the little icon with a head and the moon behind it. Okay, that's easiest option. Option number 2, and one I would suggest regardless, and that is adding some mood lighting to your image. Check out this image. We got some candles here. In this one, we've got some car lights. Yeah, they're there because it adds some interesting effect, but they're also there to get us an exposure that works. All good, and at the end of the day, really adds to the image, I think. Finally, again, breaking all the rules here, but consider, if you're still underexposed, post-processing using Photoshop and turn this guy into black and white. Black and whites are cool. All of a sudden you went from underexposed to sexy and moody. Wonderful solution. I highly recommend it. Tell everybody after the fact that, oh yeah, I meant to do that. That was a big plan. I don't care. All right, that brings us to our last topic, and that's underwater photography. Probably one of my favorite kinds of photography, and also one of the most challenging. Now, obviously, one of the solutions is to go fully manual with one of those $20,000 cameras. Well, knock yourself out. Me, I can't afford that. So I've got this little $200-300 one here. That's probably the most common challenge associated with underwater photography, and also a challenge associated with 90% of our photographs. They're taken on our silly cell phone. The camera's just not very good. Not all these controls to take advantage of. Two, in underwater photography, lighting is always an issue. It's dark down there, guys. The light does not penetrate the water very well. And finally, all underwater photography comes out looking blue-green. We won't get into the physics, but the short answer is the red end of the spectrum gets absorbed more completely, and as such, all your images come out looking blue-green. So what do? I don't worry about it. I just say, you know what? I'm going to try to get stuff into focus, and I'm going to fix all this stuff after the fact in Photoshop. Ta-da! Rabbit out of the magic hat. Because a lot of this stuff is just unsolvable. If you're taking 90% of your photos with a cell phone, changing the aperture size is not an option. Similarly, if I'm taking underwater, blue-green is going to be the way the images come out. I don't care how good a camera you have. In which case, let's just get used to saying, you know what? We're going to get stuff in focus, and then after the fact in Photoshop, we're going to clean them up. Check out these images, before and after. Magnificent after the fact. Garbage before. I would have hated to have missed this fantastic jellyfish and his buddy here, the little Sergeant Major. But without Photoshop, I'd have never gotten him back. We're going to check both Photoshop and Premiere out in the subsequent section, so stay tuned. All right, that pretty much concludes this section on photographic strategies and techniques, sports, low light, and underwater. What did we learn? First, fully manual can be your friend. Don't be afraid of it. Go out there and experiment. My suggestion, always set your ISO first. It's the most obvious one of the three variables. And just look around at your ambient light and say, okay, here's the ISO level I think I need. Next, decide between aperture and shutter based on the movement of your subject. Your subject is running all over the place. You're going to set shutter next. If your subject is just sitting still, you're going to set aperture next. Finally, for that third variable and final variable, just adjust it until your exposure meter tells you you're at 0 and you are at perfect exposure. No problem. Alternatives under these situations to fully manual are the pre-programmed settings. Low light's got one. Sports has got one. If you've got an underwater camera, it's probably got an underwater pre-programmed setting as well. All good, a reasonable alternative. What about when we don't want full manual, yet we still want to take some sports shots? What else do we need to be thinking about? Well, regardless of which mode we're in, you need to know the sport. That is, know where to position yourself and anticipate that event. They're only going to take a fraction of a second to occur. You can't wait to see it, to shoot it. You need to anticipate it. You don't know that stuff yourself, get somebody to help you out who does. Next, consider the burst mode. It can be your friend in capturing those events. Finally, there's absolutely nothing wrong shooting sports to wait for these action to slow down and capture those athletes on the sidelines or between plays, things like that. Just as effective. Next, we moved on to low light. What did we learn? Candles, windows, car lights. The extra ambient lighting can be our friend and actually enhances the mood. All good stuff. Finally, if you do underexpose that shot, consider post-processing in Photoshop to turn it to that sexy black and white. Tell everybody you meant it. You had it all set up that way. It was just too cool. You couldn't miss it. Doesn't matter to me. Finally, we looked at underwater. Biggest challenges here being we weren't using a high quality camera. And what's the chase? There are going to be a lot of pictures in our day-to-day lives, whether underwater or otherwise, that are taken on less than an optimal camera, aka cell phone. We don't want to throw those shots out, but we want to keep them around nonetheless in a high quality fashion. What's my suggestion? Post-processing in Photoshop. Remember our buddy, the jellyfish, and his little friend, the Sergeant Major. We went from an image that was basically unusable to one, that I'm not at all afraid to frame and put behind me. That's the good stuff. All right, that concludes this section. In the next one, we start jumping into Photoshop. We learn how to download the free trial version, so we'll take a look at that then. In the interim, go out there and have some fun, but keep on